7B, Part 2. This is a continuation of the female reproductive physiology. And just like with male reproductive system, we're now going to talk about the development of the gametes or eggs in the female, as we talked about sperm development in the male. Okay, so development of the eggs is called oogenesis, and in fact during the fetal period, a female fetus creates germ cells in the ovary, and they're called oogonia. Singular is oogonium. And these are 2N diploid. In other words, they have two homologous copies of each chromosome, one derived from the father, one derived from the mother. And these are ovarian stem cells, essentially, and they multiply by mitosis and store up nutrients. And they are packaged inside the ovaries into what are called primordial follicles. So there are many follicles in the female fetus ovaries, and they have oogonia in them. They have a single oogonium in each follicle. Then they transform into primary oocytes. The primary oocytes begin meiosis, reductive division, heading towards haploid or 1N. However, it stalls in the early phase of that meiosis. And then the female child is born, the infant's born, and between birth and puberty, all of those primary oocytes, which are inside primordial follicles, are dormant. So here you see follicular development. This is before birth in the female developing fetus, and you have all these oogonia or stem cells, each one inside a primordial follicle. The follicle is surrounded on the outside by a single layer of follicle cells. Okay. And it has undergone mitosis, so you have primary oocyte, again, still inside the primordial follicle. Now that primary oocyte, as I said, starts into meiosis but stalls. And these primordial follicles sit until puberty starts. So from that time of the start of puberty, the first ovulation, which is called menarche, from then on, each month from puberty till menopause, which is the cessation, stopping of the ovarian cycle, when a female no longer ovulates, every month one primordial follicle starts to develop. Each month a different primordial follicle starts to develop, and eventually goes through all the stages of the different follicular development or ovarian cycle, and releases an egg. And it's a random process which one will develop, and it's random whether it's going to be on the left side or the right side, and occasionally more than one primary follicle starts to develop, and in that case it's a potential situation where you could potentially get more than one egg being produced, released into the duct system, and therefore could end up, if they were fertilized, end up as fraternal twins. Okay, so as I said, with puberty and the onset of the ovarian cycle, you get primary follicle, a primordial follicle developing into a primary follicle, and now that primary oocyte is inside and the follicle grows, so the cells along the wall develop further and there's more of them. And as they develop, you start getting the presence of fluid in this structure until finally it becomes what's called a vesicular follicle, where you have a fluid-filled antrum. And then it bursts out through the wall of the external wall of the ovary, releasing a secondary oocyte. So we start with a primary oocyte and go to a secondary oocyte. We start with a primordial follicle developing into a primary follicle, then actually it's a secondary follicle after that, and then it's a vesicular follicle, sometimes called a Graafian follicle, and then release of a secondary oocyte. This structure here, the cells lining the follicle from the ruptured follicle, will then go on to form what's called the corpus luteum. Meanwhile here, if we look at the developing oocyte, in the primary oocyte it's 2N, has not completed that meiosis, but then it does complete meiosis, and you get split into two. You get a secondary oocyte and first polar body. The polar body does not do anything or go anywhere. It does contain a haploid number of chromosomes, one copy of each of the 23 different chromosome pairs, a single copy, but it doesn't do anything other than it can carry on the second stage of meiosis and then form two more polar bodies. Two. It can go to two polar bodies. And the polar bodies always degenerate. They cannot be fertilized. Meanwhile, the secondary oocyte is arrested in meiosis. It's arrested in a phase of meiosis, and it sits there. All right, and meanwhile, it's not actually sitting in one spot. It's getting drawn into the uterine tubes, and it is typically in the uterine tubes that if fertilization is going to occur, then it will. It gets released, as shown here, from the follicle, and it goes into the uterine tubes. If that secondary oocyte is fertilized by sperm, then immediately upon being fertilized, as soon as the sperm penetrates the egg, it undergoes second meiosis 2, splitting into a secondary, or not a secondary, what's called a second polar body and the fertilized ovum. And so in the end, you end up with 4 single copies of the chromosomes distributed between these polar bodies and the single developed and fertilized egg. And these slides go through everything that I was just saying. The first polar body and the second oocyte, secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2, but arrests, stops. It gets ovulated. If and when it's penetrated by sperm, it completes the meiosis 2, leading to one large fertilized egg and another polar body. It's called a second polar body. So you have actually 3 polar bodies and the ovum. They're the 3 polar bodies and the ovum. Okay, now this ovarian cycle has different phases. It's a monthly event leading to the maturation of that single egg. Normally only one egg matures. It has a follicular phase and a luteal phase. In the follicular phase, the whole ovarian cycle is 28 days. And the first 1 to 14 days are the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. And then the secondary oocyte is released, and the granulosa cells that form the wall of the follicle, the empty follicle, become the corpus luteum. And that luteal phase is, and that's corpus lutea, so luteal phase, that's where the name comes from. And that's the second 14-day period. It's from day 14 to 28. So ovulation occurs exactly mid-cycle at day 14. Let's go through the follicular phase. As I said, you start with a primordial follicle. A single one becomes a primary follicle. Matures each month. A single one becomes a primary follicle, which then goes on to a secondary follicle. And there are the cells around it now are not called follicle cells, but granulosa cells. That was it, granulosa cells. And you get a covering that happens, well, you get a covering on the egg. It happens to be called a zona pellucida. I think you should know this term because I'm pretty sure I talk about it when I talk about embryogenesis. But we'll see, or at the point of fertilization, we'll see. You start getting, at this stage, you start getting, with the primary oocyte inside, you start getting some spaces that are fluid filled. These eventually will go on when you get to the stage of a secondary oocyte inside the Graafian or vesicular follicle. Those spaces, fluid-filled spaces here at that stage, then go on to form this antrum, fluid-filled antrum, with the secondary oocyte in the middle. And this is what ruptures out of the side of the ovary at day 14, and you have release of the secondary oocyte. And then the granulosa cells here go on to form the corpus luteum. So here we're talking about, right here at stage 7 in this diagram, that's day 14, and then 14 to 28 is 8 and 9. Days 14 to day 28 of the follicular phase. Okay, well, this is the same diagram. I don't know why I particularly blew it up. Let's move on. Now, the follicular phase, the secondary follicle at that point, actually just before the, still in the follicular phase, the primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle, then you, secondary follicle. The primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte, and you do, it is called a secondary follicle, and then becomes a vesicular or Graafian follicle. That antrum gets bigger and isolates the oocyte. I wouldn't worry about this term here. So now the full-size vesicular follicle with that fluid-filled antrum is bulging out at the ovary's external surface, and the primary oocyte will complete meiosis 1. Stage is set for ovulation. Actually, why primary oocyte? It's secondary. I'll have to correct that. Set for ovulation and will rupture out the side. It's a secondary oocyte at that stage, not primary. That's a mistake on the previous slide. And it ruptures out right at day 14, which is marked as stage 7 here. So, secondary oocyte is expelled with ovulation. There is a term for when a woman who's ovulating actually feels the sensation of the rupture, which some women do. It happens to be called, it's a German term, it happens to be called Mittelschmerz. It's a word I doubt you'll hear again. I guess it kind of somehow, I don't know. I'm sharing it with you, don't worry about it. In 1 to 2% of ovarian cycles, there's more than one ruptured secondary oocyte. And if 2 eggs do get released, and if they are fertilized, then as I said earlier, that would result in fraternal twins. Okay, so with rupture, day 14, from then to day 28, the ruptured follicle collapses, all that fluid was released, the granulosa cells enlarge, and they form the corpus luteum. And it is the corpus luteum that is secreting the key hormones involved from this stage forward, progesterone and estrogen. If pregnancy doesn't occur, if that ruptured, released secondary oocyte does not get fertilized by a sperm cell in the uterine tube, then the corpus luteum will degenerate in about 10 days, leaving a scar, and there is a name for that scar, corpus albicans, on the ovary. Don't worry about this term. However, if pregnancy does occur, then the corpus luteum will maintain hormone production until the placenta can take over at about 3 months. So these hormones continue to be produced with fertilization of the egg. They continue to be produced by the corpus luteum until the placenta takes over later, quite a bit later. Okay, at puberty, there's establishment of this ovarian cycle, and it involves a sequence of events related to hormones. There are certain key hormones that are involved. I remind you from what you learned in endocrinology or endocrine physiology last semester that the hypothalamus produces releasing factors for several different hormones, and that includes gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is abbreviated GnRH. So you have a releasing hormone for gonadotropins. These are the gonadotropins: follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And these, of course, are produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary and can act on the ovary, on both ovaries. So if gonadotropin gets released, then it will trigger FSH and LH release, production and release by the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And this kind of thing develops until the first actual ovulation will occur and an adult cycle gets achieved. So these are the events leading up to include of puberty. Well, there's many events, of course, triggered by hormones. Let's go through some more. There is, I should point out that in childhood and just before the onset of puberty, there are small amounts of estrogen released, and low estrogen levels will inhibit release of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So these later events are not going to happen in a child until she's ready to mature enough and starts to produce gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that will be triggered, you'll see, by a rise in estrogen. I think that's on the next slide. Okay. As I said, gonadotropin releasing hormone, these are the events in the ovarian cycle. This is day 1 of the 28-day ovarian cycle. What you get is gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates release of FSH and LH, and these will stimulate follicle growth and maturation and low levels of estrogen release. So you're getting follicle growth and maturation. This is, by the way, right here, right in the middle there. I don't know how straight a line I've drawn, but right in the middle there, that's day 14. So follicle growth and maturation is occurring in here during this period, and there are low levels of estrogen which start to rise after that. So the rising level of estrogen in the latter stages of the follicular phase, this rising level of estrogen is able to inhibit any release. I'm sorry. This rising level of estrogen, low levels then slightly rising level, inhibits the release. As you can see, it's not getting released here of FSH and LH, and instead the anterior lobe of the pituitary, it's synthesizing these two gonadotropins and accumulating, storing them up. As the estrogen level increases further until you get a higher level, you get a positive feedback effect on the anterior lobe of the pituitary, causing a sudden surge of LH release. And so as it rises, it triggers this sudden surge of LH release right there, that peaking LH luteinizing hormone release. The spike in luteinizing hormone occurring here, this spike stimulates the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1, go into become a secondary oocyte, and you get triggering of release of the egg, ovulation, and the luteinizing hormone then will transform the follicle into, remember, the granulosa cells in the wall of the follicle become a corpus luteum, which can produce progesterone and estrogen. And so we get more estrogen and progesterone being produced. Okay. I don't know if we should count. Yeah, more estrogen here and progesterone being produced because of corpus luteum or luteal production of these hormones. Now, what I've done here is taken several graphs and lined them all up so you can see the association between the hormones, the gonadotropins LH and FSH, from day 1 to 14, and then from 14 to 28. And you see estrogen and progesterone, days 1 to 14 and 14 to 28. At the same time, okay, this is, of course, ovulation at day 14. So this is here on the left, the follicular phase, going from primary to secondary follicle to vesicular follicle to release or ovulation at day 14, and then going into the luteal phase where you get the granulosa cells forming the corpus luteum and producing progesterone and estrogen. The drop-off of progesterone and estrogen that is shown here is because the egg did not get fertilized. If it did get fertilized, then these would be maintained. But if it does not get fertilized, then they drop off. The corpus luteum starts to degenerate. Now, if we look also at the same time, and it's all lined up sequentially in terms of time, if we look in the uterus, at mid-cycle and compare the, and this is looking at the uterine cycle. So what's happening on the wall of the uterus, the endometrium, as I told you earlier, you have the functional layer and the basal layer, stratum functionalis and stratum basalis, I believe. And what happens in the first few days, you should realize, of course, that, let me just get rid of this. What's happening here towards the very end of the luteal phase is that menstruation is starting. The wall of the endometrium is breaking down, at least the functional layer, stratum functionalis, is breaking down. And then the female goes into a menstrual phase early on at the beginning of the follicular phase. Okay, so the menstrual period is here early on, and then the basal layer leads to production or proliferation and growth up of the functional layer. So you see the functional layer is increasing in thickness, and it's shown here, the functional layer here. So it's the functional layer that got sloughed off in the menstrual flow from the endometrium. And then here, which is about day 5, it starts to slowly, gradually build up till the point of peak fertility, which is at the time of ovulation. Females are at their peak potential to become pregnant right at the time and immediately after. I think it's plus or minus a day or two around this period of peak fertility, the highest chance of becoming pregnant. So that functional layer is built up enough so that it is ready, in fact, to, and it keeps going after, but it is ready to, if necessary, if it's present, receive the fertilized egg. If an egg is fertilized in the uterine tubes, then it will travel further down into the uterus and can implant into the wall of the uterus. So this is really what's called here the proliferative phase before ovulation at day 14, and then the secretory phase when endometrial glands are more active and the wall is particularly optimal for implantation of a fertilized egg, receiving and allowing a fertilized egg to implant into the wall. Again, if fertilization, if the egg does not become fertilized, then you get this breakdown and leading to sloughing off in menstrual flow of the functional layer. Okay. I think this is self-explanatory. Most of it I said, in fact. So we're talking down here. All right. There are feedback mechanisms. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I did mention one in which there is inhibition of gonadotropin LH and FSH if estrogen levels are low, but then as they rise, then you get this surge and increase, and the leading to the development and maturation of the follicle and ovulation at day 14, releasing that secondary oocyte. I'm not going to get into these feedbacks. One nice thing in this diagram is it does show that the gonadotropin releasing hormone is coming from the hypothalamus, and it does get exported down the stalk. I'm trying to remember the term for that. It escapes me right now. This stalk that off of which the pituitary hangs. This is here the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and this is the posterior lobe of the pituitary on the left side there. I wish I could remember that. Anyhow, let's move on. Okay, so the uterine, also called menstrual cycle, when we focus on what's happening in the uterus, as I said earlier, in the first 5 days is the menstrual phase, where the functional layer, stratum functionalis, is shedding off. This is the functional layer of the endometrium, but the deeper layer, the stratum basalis, the deeper layer isn't affected, and in fact will later lead to development and building up of a new functional layer. And that does occur, in fact, from days 16 to 14. There's the proliferative phase, where the endometrium functional layer builds itself up again. And then from 15 to 28, you have the secretory phase, where the endometrial lining, the functional layer, is in that phase where the glands are being produced and are more active, and the wall is prepared for implantation of the embryo. Okay, no fertilization, progesterone drops off, and the endometrium doesn't have the hormonal support it needs to be maintained, at least the functional layer. There are spiral arteries in the functional layer of the endometrium, and they kink, they pinch off, they go into spasms, and causing a reduction in flow of blood into that tissue, and the functional layer endometrial cells begin to die. So the functional layer essentially begins to sort of digest itself, break apart. Spiral layers are constricting for one final time, and then there's a sudden relaxation, and they open up, and there's a blood flow which flushes fragments. No, that's doesn't flush fragments. The rush of blood that occurs with that relaxation of the vessels, spiral arteries, after first constricting, then relaxing, the rush of the blood will break apart the weakened capillary beds, and the functional layer starts to slough off. Okay, so we're talking about here in the first 5 days. I'm not sure why I put this here, but it's the drop off again of progesterone, estrogen that leads to the functional layer sloughing off in the first 5 days of the follicular phase, the menstrual cycle, menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. Okay. Here you see quite well these lengthening in the secretory phase, lengthening, maturing endometrial glands. What are the extrauterine effects of female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that are produced by that corpus luteum or by the ovaries? Well, the ovaries produce a rising level of estrogen during puberty. So as a female enters into puberty, estrogen production levels or secretion levels are increasing, released from the ovaries. This promotes the start of oogenesis, development of eggs, and follicular growth, so that a primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle. But it also, that estrogen, rising estrogen, has anabolic effects on the female reproductive tract. All of the duct structures Uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina will grow larger. They become functional. Uterine tubes and the uterus start to exhibit more motility, and the vaginal mucosa will get thicker and the external genitalia will mature. We're talking about the labia, clitoris, start maturation. So, other estrogen-induced secondary sex characteristics include the increase in size of the breasts, increased deposit of subcutaneous fat everywhere on the body. Females have a thicker layer of subcutaneous fat on all over the body, but especially in the hips and breasts with onset of puberty. This is due to estrogen. These are considered secondary sexual characteristics. The thicker layer of fat just underneath the skin, actually, when you're putting a IV needle into a young female, a younger female, then sometimes you have to just angle it just slightly more so that you get into it, because there is that fat layer that's not obvious but there compared to in a male. You get changes of the pelvis, the bones, and the pelvic girdle, and growth of axillary and pubic. Axillary is in the armpit, and pubic is obvious pubic hair. Okay. Now, with sexual maturation and puberty and sexual maturation, the female can go into sexual response, and this is due to stimulation of clitoris and vaginal mucosa. With sexual stimulation, what happens is that the clitoris, vaginal mucosa, and breasts will enlarge somewhat and gorge with blood, particularly the clitoris and vaginal mucosa. The vestibular glands will lubricate. This is the greater vestibular glands will lubricate the vestibule. That's the opening of the vagina, external opening of the vagina, and this, of course, would ease entry of the erect penis into the vagina. All of this is mediated by the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. With continued stimulation and continued increasing intensity of the sexual response, it leads to orgasm, which is accompanied by big increase in overall skeletal muscle tension, increase in pulse rate and blood pressure, and rhythmic contractions of the uterus and vagina. These are peristaltic kind of contractions that are in the direction an upwards direction, and all of this is mediated by a sudden surge in sympathetic output from the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. There is no refractory period after orgasm. The female is in the male, and the second or more, even multiple, could occur in a brief period of time. And that orgasm, unlike in the male, who has to have an orgasm, in the female it is not essential for conception to occur. I believe that is the last slide. And that's the end of Unit 7B, Part 2.